and welcome to today's webcast. Before we get started, we're going to go through some housekeeping rules to make sure this event is as interactive and enjoyable as possible. Firstly, if you wish to ask your presenter a question, feel free to use the Ask a Question tab, which is located on the bottom right corner of your screen. If your presenter has uploaded any supporting documentation, you will also find this in the Resources tab. And should you require support at any stage, please feel free to contact Redback on the toll-free number, which is located in the bottom left corner of your screen. Enjoy your webcast.
Good afternoon, everybody. Lewis, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, Nigel.
Now, we should forewarn everybody, Lewis is currently suffering from the man flu, so I have some tissues just in case we need them.
That's right. I'm going to try and survive the hour.
Try and survive the hour, and I've been told I have to apologise for having grown a beard in the last month. I'm told it's not particularly photogenic, but we'll struggle through, OK? We'll struggle through. Look, we've got a really big audience today. It's over 1,000 people. And we're very, very conscious that it traverses a very wide span of businesses. We've got some childcare centres, we've got some multinationals with us. So we're going to try and give you a little bit of an insight along the journey about managing performance. Elements of what we do today is going to be very much about the HR side, and then also we're going to get into the technical side as well. So we'll press on, press on. I just want to talk a little bit about why to begin with, why invest time and money in this space. You've yielded to me, haven't you? I'm going to do some work on the foundations, and I'll explain why I want to do that earlier.
Yeah, Nigel's commandeered the first section of the presentation. It looked a bit different a few days ago, and there's some things he's particularly passionate about. So I'm relinquishing the start, and Nigel has some things he wants to get off his chest, which is great. And I'm sure we're all going to benefit from it. Well,
Thanks.
I hope we are, Nigel.
Thanks. I'll take you through it. It's all right. It's all right. I want to talk about different types of performance management. We're going to get into the reinforcing performance management, the positive stuff. And then we'll talk about the remedial side, the negative stuff. Keen to cover the technical stuff as well. There's got a lot of people in the audience who really want to go through that technical side. And then we'll wrap up looking at sort of the must-dos, the things you've really, really got to get right. I doubt, given the size of the audience, we have to explain this, but just to reinforce the issue, if you want a progressive workplace culture, if you want a high-performing team, you've got to get the balance right between the positive management of performance and then the negative management of poor performance. You've got to get that right. You really want to get the best out of your people. It costs a lot to employ them, to recruit them, to onboard them. And so it's really about optimising the individual's performance, and it's about optimising the team's performance.
And Nigel, the thing there is that we know with a lot of our HR managers as clients that they often spend so much of their time on managing underperformance and focusing on the people they have to, because they're the ones causing potentially some damage in the business. But you then forget about the ones that are actually performing at a good level and trying to keep them there. And that's where it's hard, and that's why you're reinforcing the need for the balance. So hopefully there's some stuff you can help us with it at the front end.
So let me kick off. And normally when we do these things, I talk a lot about culture and engagement, and I think most people probably are on board with that. We've been doing a lot of work recently with frontline leaders, with some of our clients, really trying to get this area right. And a lot of those businesses are currently changing rapidly. They're reorganising, doing transformation projects and the like. And every time I go out there at the moment, I see them getting things wrong before we even get to the conversation about performance management. And I've called these things the foundations, and I just want to have a quick discussion about those if I can. So the first one is job clarity. It's remarkable how often you find people in a business and they don't quite know what their job entails, particularly if they've just gone through a business restructure and their job's actually morphed a little bit along the way. And there's some key things you've got to get right. They've really got to understand what tasks they're performing. It's very, very important they understand what business systems they're actually going to be working with and operating with. And probably the one which I see failing more often than not these days, particularly in the last year, is they don't understand where their job fits into the broader organisation. And so they sort of feel a little bit lost, a little bit isolated in their job. So before we even talk about the positive and the negative stuff, make sure you've got the answer to the question around job clarity. Do employees understand the job they're doing, what it entails? You've got to get that question answered in the positive. The second one I see a lot of failings with at the moment is delegation. And I don't just mean senior executive delegation, but actually sitting down. I sat down recently with some shift crews. And I sort of said to them, well, what are you allowed to do? What aren't you allowed to do? And they were kind of dumbfounded by the question. They didn't quite understand how to answer it. You got a lot of people saying to me, well, I think we're allowed to do so-and-so. I think if we want to do this, we're going to go and talk to the shift supervisor. So the next one is make sure people understand what the delegation authorities are, what decision-making authority people have got. And that's number 2 of my foundations. My third one is expectations. Do people actually understand the outcomes they must achieve? And I normally phrase this very simply. I say to people, if I'm out on the shop floor in particular, but I can do this for management as well, what do you have to do for your job to be a success? And if they sort of look at you and go, well, I think I need to do this, or I suspect I need to do that, you really haven't answered the question very, very well. So I'm not just talking about here about setting KPIs and the really sort of hard, rigid stuff, just about do people understand what they need to achieve when they come to work every day. So that's foundation number 3. And my last one is, bear with me, the last one is boundaries. And it's increasingly one that we come up against. That is, do people understand what are the boundaries for their behaviour? Now, if you've got corporate values, that's living the values, but it's also just day-to-day behaviour. It's, you know, what language can I use? How can I dress in the workplace? And I see increasingly some lack of clarity around all of those 4 issues. And honestly, if you don't get those right to begin with, you're amplifying problems later on. And my experience probably tells me this, that it's really about how effectively you're onboarding people. If you don't onboard them properly, they'll probably make up the answers to a lot of those things. They might be right, they might be wrong. Or they'll learn the answers from existing employees. And again, it might be right or it might be wrong. And I read the test you want to give yourself is, if you can't make sure that people have got this right in the first 6 weeks, you're probably going to have issues later on. So that's my passionate plea to the audience today, is really you need to nail those foundations. If you don't get those foundations right, trouble is probably going to be looming. So let's put Nigel's current philosophical views aside for a minute. Let's talk about 2 sides of performance management. There's the reinforcing side, the positive side. There's the remedial side. And let's not forget that these are both reactive and systemic. And I think we'll start with the positive because it's a good place to, and it's one that never gets mentioned more often than not.
That's right. And with the positive performance management, as I said earlier, the reality is that often we see too much time being directed elsewhere within the business. The way I see positive performance management, and perhaps the example is a little crass, but I'll run with it anyway, is that I see almost, you could take the analogy of a car tyre in the sense that usage over time, it starts to deflate a bit. You know, it's still reliable, it still runs, but just the bounce that was there initially might not be there. And what you need to do every now and then is just pump those tyres up a bit. You need to keep giving it a bit more energy. And it's about reinflating. It's about giving the employee in this context that energy to keep going. And whilst often you might have rational drivers you can use, the pay rise, the promise of a promotion, those are things you unfortunately can't use that often. A business only has so much money to give. You as an HR manager, a business owner, might only have so much cash in the pool. So what can you do at a day-to-day level to keep people engaged, to keep them fronting up to work and happily doing their job, even though you might not be able to give them that big pay offer that might be available somewhere else? What can we do?
And I think the audience would know, but all of the literature tells us that the most important element of performance is the immediate manager. If they look up and they see a manager who is inspiring, leads by example, that in and of itself is probably going to drive performance better than anything else, which is why I always say if you're going to spend $1 on development, do it on the immediate manager rather than necessarily sending the executive to Stanford. I know I get chastised for saying that sometimes by HR directors, but they're the key. So let's just look at some positive. And we've got a polling question.
That's right.
So let's have some audience participation. And I think the question we're going to poll is: does giving ad hoc feedback come naturally to you or other managers? And we'll open the lines now for the question, and we'll come back to it in a couple of minutes while we talk on. This is a kind of bugbear of mine, and it's been a bugbear of mine for a long time. And I have a sneaking suspicion that it's a cultural issue in Australia, but we are very bad at giving ad hoc positive feedback. And there's 4 key elements to ad hoc positive feedback. It's got to be specific. So don't please use cliches because they just don't work with Australians in particular. It's got to be immediate. And I use the phrase always, you know, you need to catch somebody doing something good. It's got to be personal. You've got to express you're expressing gratitude. You've got to express it in an emotive and personal way. And it's going to be spontaneous. And one of the great things about giving ad hoc positive feedback is it can be simple, short. If you do catch somebody in the act of doing something well, it's a very nice way, as you put it, reinflating the tyre. But it also immediately says, I'm being recognised, I'm being acknowledged in a way that most people are very, very comfortable with. It's not the grand hurrah moment of sort of outing you in front of your colleagues, which Australians find very, very difficult to cope with. I find when I go around and do a lot of frontline leadership development work, this is the area where they really struggle. They aren't very good at this, and the problem with that is that if you don't do things like this, performance management simply becomes a negative conversation. So this is where you have to start. If you can't get this right and you can't build this into a habit, you're going to struggle quite seriously.
I just want to pick up from 2 things there, Nigel. The first is I do want to reinforce this notion of the performance feedback being immediate. What you'll find if someone has actually spent a considerable period of time on a piece of work or they've really gone above and beyond, think about the impact it has if you don't acknowledge it or you don't give the feedback. All of a sudden, they're sitting there thinking, oh, I went to all that effort and my manager didn't notice. Now, if you're planning on giving that positive feedback in a month's time or 2 months' time, it's too late because they're already deflated. They're already disengaged because my boss didn't notice that at the time. So they're feeling a bit down on themselves for 2 or 3 weeks. Then when they've kind of gotten over it, that's when you give the feedback. Well, it hasn't really had any effect. And you've led to a disengagement effectively driver there instead of something that you're actually hoping to be reinforcing of engagement. So it really is critical that in that week that it happens, it's noticed and acknowledged. I think any later and it's probably worthless or in fact taking in the wrong direction.
The audience has proved me wrong because I've got 70% of people here say it comes naturally to them. So perhaps we've worked together in past lives or something like that. But I'm really pleased if that's the number. That's an excellent outcome. The other thing as well is that you need to get experience at doing this. I've worked with, in our business, I've worked with people who don't do it naturally, and it sounds quite stolted the first time, the second time, third time. Eventually, you kind of get used to doing it. And people also, after a while, go, okay, that's just you giving me positive feedback rather than actually doing something special.
The other thing I wanted to raise, Nigel, is what are your views in relation to the utility or the desire to use 2 different methods of feedback? One is the personal one, which we really talked about here, direct one-on-one, versus public acknowledgement. Now, you mentioned how that can sometimes be perceived. Is there ever a role for the public acknowledgement in terms of positive feedback?
I must say, culturally, I get in trouble with this all the time. It's unambiguous, the first one, the one-on-one, great stuff.
Great idea.
I'm a big fan of, in a public forum, saying when somebody's done something well. But there's a strange cultural element in Australia that there'll be somebody in the audience. If I say you've done well, there'll be somebody in the audience who'll say, well, that probably means I haven't. So it's just something cultural we've got in this country. I'm not sure why. If we were in America, it wouldn't happen. If we were in England, it wouldn't happen. But in Australia, you have to be a little bit more sanguine about when you single individuals out. The other problem you've got as well, if you've got 30 people in the room and I say, gee, I want to congratulate you, you've done a great job, and I haven't noticed that Bob's done a great job, then Bob feels pretty bad as well. So all I would say is be more considered about how you're doing the public stuff and understand...
a bit more sparing.
A bit more sparing and understand whether or not there's any unintended consequences. But start with this one. This is the one to start with, no doubt about that. Now, more structured feedback, and we would probably take about 6 hours talking about structured performance management in terms of should you have annual reviews, half-yearly reviews. All of the literature today at the moment says the annual review is a dead thing. surprisingly, probably more than about 70% of the companies we work with still have an annual review of some kind. What I will say, though, is this: it needs to be timely. And what I mean by that is different people, different businesses, timely means different things. So if I'm in a call centre, I'm probably actually wanting to give structured feedback at least, if not daily, on a weekly basis. If I'm in a different business, it might be quarterly. For a lot of businesses, at least having some structured process on an annual basis is not a bad thing, as long as it's not the only process you've got.
That's what I was going to say. The danger
thing.
of the structured is that people think that's the only time we talk about how someone's going. And if that's your approach, that's a disaster. Yeah.
Now, the one thing I will say is I meet a lot of businesses, particularly small businesses, startups, who say, well, we'll do this when we want to. And they often straight away tie performance feedback to salary review. They go, oh, that's all very discretionary. So somebody might actually go 2 years without any structured conversation. You've really got to avoid that type of behaviour. So it's got to be timely, and my next proposition is it's got to be recurring. So if you are only going to do it annually, please do it every year and make sure you're giving feedback. And remember, feedback is not just a conversation about performance and behaviours. It's about aspirations. It's about development opportunities and the like. And the one thing I will please make sure it's face-to-face. We had Lewis is chuckling because we had a client the other day who rang us up and said, look, I got this amazing new performance management computer platform system. And I said, oh, that's brilliant, Phil. What does it do for you? And Phil said, look, he said, you don't actually have to meet with the person you're talking to anymore. They fill in their bit and you fill in your bit, and then you have this online chat. He says, brilliant. We don't actually have to meet face-to-face. And I sort of quietly looked at this HR director and I said, isn't that defeating the purpose of performance management? So, look, what I would say is that technology aside, if you're not in a situation where I can sit down and look Lewis in the eyes and say, look, Lewis, I want to talk about the good and the bad. I want to talk about the good, the areas for development, however you want to, what language you use, whatever it is. You've got to be doing that face-to-face.
And if I can just raise a technical tip at this point, we're going to talk about the technical stuff much later, but I have noticed that a lot of clients more and more are now putting in contracts of employment and things like that, commitments to certain performance processes, particularly in probationary periods. We will review this point and that. Just unnecessary. I mean, this should be something about your culture that you develop organically and that you use. There's no need to be committing to any rigid or structured process in your contractual documents. Your contractual documents at most might say something about we may review this annually or whatever, but you want to be very careful about making all these commitments up front, because then if you don't, because we all know we start off with great ambitions and time gets the better of us, you then have this scenario where you might be moving to terminate someone either in probation or outside, saying, well, we've got a right to terminate, 4 weeks' notice, whatever it is, poor performance. And they might say, yeah, well, you've got that right to terminate. The person might not have unfair dismissal access, but you've got all these contractual representations that you would do A, B, C, D, and E. You didn't do any of it. And that's contributed to the employee being in the situation they are. So can you please be careful about putting those types of things in your contractual documents? Keep it out. Do it by policy, do it organically.
Yeah, because these are things which as the years go by, they're going to change. They're going to be refined. Situation, circumstances is going to change as well, and sort of current knowledge and ideas about what's best practice is going to change as well. So you want to allow these things to evolve. I'm with you. Don't hardwire these processes into your employment contracts. Please don't. And yeah, if you want some help with that, give Lewis a call and he'll make sure you're okay. So look, that's the kind of positive side. That's the positive side as we see it. Please make sure that you spend as much time focusing on the positive side as you do the negative side. In fact, I prefer to see people spend a lot more time focusing on the positive side than the negative side. There's nothing worse than sitting in a work team and you sit there and you go, gee, I'm doing a really good job, but Bob over there, who's a bit of a dick, he seems to be getting all the attention. Why don't I get some attention? So that's the positive side of the equation. So let's talk about the remedial. I've used the word remedial. We could say negative. We could say poor performance. But I prefer the word remedial these days because you really want to remember that you're trying very, very hard to take one of your people who's not quite doing what you want and to actually get them back on the path. Rather than how do I sack somebody as quickly as possible, because you've made an investment in the individual. I always like, you and I have had this conversation many, many times. I always like to say, you know, to please remember why people don't perform. There's a lot of reasons. I think on the slide there's the proposition of the bad egg theory. You've probably adopted this theory in your lives at some stage. You know, Lewis was born bad, he grew up bad, he started work bad. He'll always be bad, and the sooner we get rid of him out of our business, the better we'll be. I'll be honest, after 30 years of doing this, that's a pretty rare person. Yeah. I've met them. I have met them. I could probably still name after 30 years who they are, but for the most part, if people stop performing or they start to behave in a way that you're not comfortable with, there's normally a very, very good reason for it. And we've put some up on the slide, which are the common ones that we come in contact with.
And the way I like to sometimes refer to this is, I mean, it's very rare, isn't it, for your employee to wake up this morning, for any employee to wake up and think, you know what, I really want to go into work today and underperform. That's what I like to do. And next week, I reckon I'm going to do that too, because that's just looks like a good thing to do. No one goes out to set about doing things that way. They actually want to achieve good outcomes in the business for themselves, for their family, for their self-worth. And so that's what I tend to agree with Nigel. You need to be looking for the root cause. A lot of them will be in the workplace. I think generally it will be within the workplace. So that's where we talk about matching of the skills to the job. Are they appropriately trained? Are expectations appropriately communicated? And that goes back to some of Nigel's foundational points. Do we have the right type of work for this person that matches their skill set? All those types of things. But you do need to be conscious that on occasion the cause may well be outside of work. And if the cause is outside of work, what you need to think about is, well, how do I need to approach that? Is this something where I know so-and-so is going through a difficult time right now to do with one of their children or their personal relationship? It might be that they just need 5-6 weeks of just a bit of air, a bit of room, breathing space, and then they'll get back to it. And so you don't actually need to ride them hard or anything like that. It's more about giving them room to move and just that extra space they may need. It may be something more serious. It may be a mental health issue outside the workplace to do with, again, personal circumstances. And you might be looking at more structured accommodations, whether it's to do with their working arrangements, the types of things they're doing in their job. But just bear in mind that every now and then the cause might be outside of work. And again, you need to grapple with that.
It's a good observation in the sense of if I look at you and I say, look, he's not behaving the way he normally would do, whatever, then I want to get to the root cause. I want to be sensitive about it. Got to be careful about invading your private life. So there's a very sort of sensitive approach that's required in that. Obviously, if you want to open up to me, then it's a question of how far I might go from a corporate perspective, values perspective, general approach perspective in terms of trying to support you. But I think the bottom line is this, is that please just don't assume that somebody was good one day and gone bad the next. And I'll be frank, one of the things I see increasingly at the moment is, particularly since the GFC, I've seen a lot of people downsize. A lot of people in work at the moment sometimes get tired. And it's not that they're underperforming in the sense of they've gone bad, they're just weary. I actually see it in a lot of managers at the moment whose jobs seem over the last 10 years to have got bigger and bigger in terms of their scope. So just proposition number one is just try and understand, first of all, what the root cause of the underperformance is. Now, we're going to ask a fun question, or we'll just poll a fun question. Do you find managing poor performance easy? Now, please answer this honestly, because I suspect...
I'm still sceptical about...
I'm still sceptical about the first round of the polling, so please answer this honestly, because if I'm right from experience, then most people will say they don't find managing poor performance easy, but we'll find out very, very quickly as we just press on. One of the things I want to say is one of the things I see a lot of the time is that people fail to stay objective when they're managing poor performance. There's something in what's happened that's kind of pressed their buttons. They're a little bit off balance in terms of how they approach it, particularly sometimes where it's, oh, look, you know, I've had my eye on Lewis for a while, and it's really, really important to stay objective. It's really, really important to understand whether or not you're in balance as you approach dealing with the issue. And really need to be honest with yourself about whether or not you've gone off a little balance here. Really happens when you feel criticised, if your personal values are compromised, particularly in terms of somebody's behaviour. The one which I always see come home to roost a lot of times is, I've been involved in this before, and straight away you get preconceptions as to what may or may not have happened. You make assumptions about the individual before you even look into the matter. So one of the things I really do want to sort of hone in on as we get into this is you really do need to stay objective. There's some really important... Oh, look, we've got some answers. Oh, look, everybody's been terribly honest.
Oh, they all find it good now.
88% said no, it's not an easy thing to do.
You just didn't scold them before the
I didn't scold them properly enough, did I? I didn't scold them properly. Do you know what? I tell you this, that's about right. That's about right. When I think about my experience over the years, that is about right. Can I also say this, that should be right as well. I get a bit daunted by people. Occasionally I meet managers who go, I really enjoy doing this, or I really enjoy sacking people, and I'm not entirely convinced that that's the right value set to take into it. It shouldn't really be easy in a way, particularly if you get to terminate somebody's employment. It probably should actually make you stay up the night before a little bit and think about it. So I'm not surprised by that answer, but it also actually in some ways might be the right answer. If it's a competency issue, just afterwards give us a call and we'll come and work with you happily. Go on.
Yeah, no, before you dig into this, Nigel, I think the other thing that I wanted to really set as an important issue up front is that when we talk about managing performance, we will get, I know often people want to talk about the termination part of it. That's going to happen later on. But that's the last part of a performance management process. The key about this remedial part of performance management is to get your employee performing back at that level that you wanted. And the only way you're going to achieve that is by starting early. Starting early and starting softly, and then progressively having a measured approach from there on in. So if you are starting with a performance improvement plan, you're cooked to begin with. It's not going to go very well. You need to be able to jump onto this very promptly, and you should be starting with very informal discussions early on that says, look, just wanted to have a chat with you about X, Y, and Z. Maybe next time we can do it slightly a bit differently. Do you see how maybe then that way the clients will, it'll pop to the client a bit more, whatever you're working on. And the way I see it is you almost have a person floating along an imaginary line, and the underperformer has dipped below this imaginary line, and you're using the performance management process to push them back up to the imaginary line. And you're trying to use quite soft mechanisms that we're going to talk about to try and coax them back up to where you want them. And if that doesn't work, then they drop a bit lower, and then you're going to want to push them back up again. And then if that doesn't work, we get into more formal discussions. We're talking about warnings or performance improvement plans. And again, you're still trying to get them back up to the line, but your prospects of success as you get to each stage diminishing.
Yeah.
And you know that eventually, as we go down this continuum...
It's not working, we're going to end somewhere.
You're going to end somewhere. But if you don't start early and promptly with that softer stuff, then you're always going to end up at termination. And we don't necessarily want that to be the case. There's a lot of cost in turnover, there's emotional cost involved as well. If you can start early, your prospects of success are pretty good. So please start early, start softly with some of the more informal stuff Nigel's going to talk about now. And then we go down that continuum a bit further, we'll make sure you're armed with the skills to ensure you don't end up with a successful unfair dismissal claim against you. Yeah. But start early and softly is my message.
And in doing that, I've identified 4 skills here, and certainly HR people should have these skills. But really, if you're a line manager to some level and you're dealing with individual employees and their performance, you need some of these skills. And they're critical skills when you're actually dealing with negative but also positive performance management. Number 1, obviously, is listen, and most people will understand what I mean by active listening. It's about body language, tone, as well as the actual words. I think when you go into these processes, if you're able to be empathetic, that is, you're able to put yourself a little bit in their shoes, the language you use becomes more supportive rather than antagonistic, and that's a really positive thing, as you say early on. The one area where I see a lot of frontline supervisors fail is they struggle to be assertive. They don't like doing the this makes me feel or I think, and you need to be assertive when you're dealing with these issues so you have absolute clarity. And that ability to de-escalate, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through, because de-escalation on occasions is a really important thing, not just to de-escalate conflict, but also to give you breathing space sometimes to make a more considered decision. So these are the skills you need, and I would say if you think you don't have these skills, this is an area where you would want to think about development. Now, as I said at the beginning, let's be objective. A few years ago somebody said to us, well, is there one piece of paper I can put on my wall which deals with how I do this? And we ended up saying, yep, we'll give you one piece of paper, and this is our famous one piece of paper. And look, at the end of the day, no matter what it is, it could be horrible, violent assault in the workplace, or it could be somebody's just late for work on a recurring basis. The same process applies. And the first proposition is very simple, that is, please establish the facts. And in our experience, with some sadness, we find that this is probably one of the areas where most people fail very, very early. I'll give you a very quick example of sort of how things can go wrong very, very quickly. A small one and a big one. We recently had a case where somebody had an employee who was late for work. The employer made certain assumptions about how late they were for work based on what somebody had told him. Later on, when he actually went back and looked at the records, he found out that what he was told versus what actually happened were miles apart, and yet he'd already started down the path. We had another one recently on a much broader scale where we had a client who had a safety issue, very serious issue, which potentially could have led to, subject to everything being done properly, a dismissal of some employees. 14 people involved actually in the incident. After talking to 8, generally there was a consistent theme coming out. They didn't bother talking to the other 6. We got involved and said, gee, it wouldn't be a bad idea asking the other 6. After they spoke to the other 6, they came back and said, well, it would appear that things are completely different from what we thought. So just establishing the facts is critical before you actually get into
And what that means is really interviewing the relevant people. So you need to identify who has relevant knowledge about the incident. Let's interview them. If there's other information that's relevant, whether they be policies that apply, CCTV footage, any other material that's relevant, you need to review and have an understanding of it. If there's a scene that needs to be inspected, inspect the scene. But you need to gather whatever, and depending on the severity of the issue at hand will depend the level of rigour involved, but you need to gather all relevant information about the issue, including interviewing relevant witnesses, before you then go to the next step.
So if it's just a general performance issue, it might be as simple as, well, what are your performance indicators? How have you been performing over the last 3 months? To, we've had a fight and we need to interview 13 people who are in the crib shed when the fight happened.
And with performance, there may be, depending on the nature of the interviews, there may be 2 or other 3 people that you just have to speak to find out, well, what is it that was wrong with the quality of the service on this occasion? Why is it that we're saying that so-and-so already always delivers this report late? It might be there's something else contributing. You need to build that picture. So that's the first thing.
Once you've done that, all we want you to do is to actually put those facts and the position to the employee concerned. And again, if it's Jane, look, for the last 3 days you've been late for work by half an hour. I'm just want to get your response to that. So we just want to put it to people. Now, as Lewis said, if it's a sort of serious altercation or whatever, that might be done with a much higher level of formality. But establish the facts, put the position to the employee, and then allow them to respond. Now, in the Jane example, it's probably going to be a very straightforward conversational discussion about, well, let me explain why I was late, I'm sorry, whatever. In the fight situation, it might be, well, I'm responding now, but I might have to come back and think some more, whatever. But facts, put position, allow respond.
And the only thing I'd add to that is the opportunity to respond has to be a genuine opportunity, or another way you could, I don't really like this term, but it could be a fair opportunity to respond. And what that means is, again, it'll depend. For Jane, we'll speak to her about it on the morning and she can respond straight away. For the serious allegation, they might, to be fair to them, they might need 5 days to consider the allegations, have the allegations in advance, consider, get advice, respond. And what a genuine opportunity to respond is will depend on the circumstances of the case. The more serious, that's when you're going to be building in extra time to respond. I don't think anyone usually needs more than a week. So I think for the most serious allegation, which has a level of complexity about it, that might be how much you need. It would only be in something extraordinarily complex or where there's some other factor preventing the employee responding that you'd need to go beyond that.
And that's why we've stuck in the far right-hand corner situation and context, because situation and context plays its way through this. You're right, in the smaller case it would be, can we just have a chat about what happened last week? In the bigger case it might be a 3-page letter saying this is what we think happened, we're putting you on notice and can we have a conversation about it? And then consider the response and explain what your position is about the response. In the simpler example, you could probably consider it on the spot and explain what how you feel. In the more serious example, it might very well be you're going to go away for a few days and think long and hard about it. You might need to go and talk to some other people about it, bounce your ideas off, and then come back and explain your actions that you're going to take. Now, believe it or not, if you apply that process subject to situation and context, every time you have a negative performance management process, you will have afforded the person that famous thing which we call procedural fairness.
Yep.
And more often than not, as Lewis will explain shortly, that's the undoing, is the procedural fairness side. So if you have this sort of schematic on your wall,
tattooed inside the eye,
tattooed inside the eye, you'll be doing okay. Now we've got a few little odds and sods on the screen, and we might just go through them because I'm going to start with the one on the right-hand side if I can. I am a passionate advocate for what's called the performance improvement plan. With what that normally is, and we've got one. If people want to borrow ours, they can borrow ours. You know, let's say I've sat down with somebody, their work's just fallen off of late. It's not a serious issue in the sense of I don't want to issue them warnings or anything. But what I want to do now is I want to tell them what I expect them to be doing over the next couple of months. I'm going to track it with them and assist them in terms of any help they need, retraining, whatever it is to get there. Now, I should document that. And we should document it in something called the performance improvement plan. Most companies should have them. But what it does for me is, if you think about Lewis's example, it gives the person very great clarity about what I expect. It tells them what the review period is, and off we go. And if they start to fail with that, I really do have a nice backup and process started before I move into more serious things. So I'm an advocate for the performance improvement plan. It stuns me how many times I go into large companies and they go, we don't use them. So please start making that a habit. We've got a couple of other ideas on the slide, which is really important. We'll just quickly go through them. We often get this question of, and you and I argue about the phrase all the time, but, you know, well, Bob and John had a fight in the crib shed. Can we stand them down while we investigate? We won't get into the details of whether or not stand down's the right phrase, but you're entitled while you investigate to ask people to stay home on pay.
Yep, provided you pay them.
Provided you pay them. Please don't think you can get away not paying them. And really you need to test that. My test normally is it easier for me to investigate with them while they're at home? That is, they're not going to pollute or pervert the investigation and so on. The whole question about, well, I've got a performance issue, I'm going to ask the employee to come in. Are they entitled to a support person?
Short answer is it depends, really, in the sense that what I say is when you get to a serious level discussion, we're talking about something that might result in warnings, perhaps an improvement plan, or certainly termination. That's when you're going to be saying, you know what, it's really preferable to give them the opportunity to have a support person present, because if we don't, then that's where we will find that there might be some procedural criticism later on. Certainly, if you're in a dismissal context and you don't offer the support person, that is something that will be considered as a procedural defect in any unfair dismissal proceedings. But I would say that also applies at the earlier stages, such as final warning, such as a performance improvement plan. At those, once you're getting to something quite substantive, I don't see why you wouldn't offer it. As many of our clients now know, the support person is not an advocate that can act as the representative of the employee. They're there to provide emotional support. They might ask for a break to help the employee regather their thoughts, something like that. That's fine. The one thing that I would say about support people is, and the way in which they're treated is, because HR managers and businesses have become quite clued on as to what the boundaries are in respect to support people, I find they're often very eager to ram down everyone's throat the role of support person. Your role is not to speak. Your role is to sit there, shut up, and basically you're nothing, and you will know you're nothing, and that's it, and now I'm going to talk to this person. And it's such an aggressive way to start a meeting. The way I would prefer is you give them the opportunity to have a support person. In 7 out of 10 cases, the support person will sit there quite amiably, not be a problem. In the 8th case, they might say a little bit, but it's not a big deal. And then in 2 out of 10 cases, they might be a little bit obstructionist. And if they are, that's when you say to them, well, look, your role here is not an advocate. You're not a representative. You're here to provide support, and that's all we're going to let you to do.
I tend to do it the other way as well. I must say, every now and again, very large clients say, look, can you come and help us with this one? And if that happens, I would normally say to the support person, look, I really do appreciate that you want to help John, but I actually need to hear it from John, okay? So I understand that you're keen to do it, but John, can I please hear the answer from you? And I tend to try and do it that way rather than necessarily just put the person back in their box.
And the reason why that's so important is because there have been a number of instances that I've personally witnessed where you end up in an unfair dismissal case where what happens is the employee later on starts to try and detach themselves from what was said on their behalf, particularly if there's any suggestion of dishonesty or even owning errors in a performance issue or a serious performance process. The employee said, well, no, I didn't accept that. Well, no, that was said in the meeting. Well, no, they said that, the support person, but I didn't say that. And you need to ensure that what's being said is actually genuinely being owned by the employee. Otherwise, it's more difficult to rely on it later. So that's why we're particularly passionate about that. There's one other thing that I want to raise about this whole process, Arrow, which I think if there's one thing you take away from today, if you've got that slide imprinted in your brain, that's a win for us. But the other thing to remember is, again, a question about degree when we come to documenting these things. So, yes, if you've got a performance improvement plan, a warning or a final warning, that's where you're going to be offering these support people. You're going to be documenting what you do and give the employer warning. But remember, we're applying this process earlier on as well. So when you have that off-the-cuff discussion early on, you need to be very conscious about how you document things. You don't want to be writing necessarily in your very first chat with the employee, well, I just want you to know that we're documenting all of this and we're issuing you with letters, because that's going to overly formalise things and scare the employee away and have a counterproductive effect. So you will have this discussion, you'll go through this process, but you're not going to be overly formal about it. You may then go away to your desk or to your office and you might make a personal note or send yourself an email about what happened. That's very important because that is about keeping a contemporaneous record. And a lot of the managers we deal with will keep just like an A4 diary that of each day has a page and they can write down what happened in that day. So it's not that you don't keep a record, but for that early stuff, you might just keep your own record. Then as it gets a little bit more serious, you might say to the employee, well, look, I'm just going to shoot you an email confirming what it is we talked about. That might be it. That's the only thing you do. And then gradually it steps up in formality. And again, this is all about keeping in mind that continuum of performance, that we deal with it softly first up, but let's make sure we have some contemporaneous proof.
No, you're right.
Then later on we have the more formal documentation.
And with underperformance, I'd probably say to most people, look, if it's just underperformance, fireside chat first, diary note, move to a performance improvement plan, probably a second in performance. If that's not working, we're getting into the serious stuff.
And then you're formally documenting everything.
Absolutely right.
Just remember that degree of the measured response.
Now, we always get asked about warnings. I thought we'd just quickly touch on it. We won't take too long on it. But there's no actual golden rule about how many warnings you need. At the end of the day, it's about, did you actually put everything to the person? Have they been given reasonable opportunity to improve, respond and the like? But to be fair, a lot of employers out there will probably say, well, if I'm going to get formal, I'll probably give a verbal warning. I'll give a first warning. They then get into a sort of second or final warning, and then there's this sort of show cause and dismissal process. So the bottom line is this: if you are going to adopt as a matter of general policy and approach a warning process, then you just need to understand that you're talking about a graduated process. The exclusion, of course, the exception to that is serious misconduct, serious and willful misconduct, which obviously jumps you straight away to, well, should you, Lewis, after punching John, stay in your job? But there's no, we often get asked, is there a law that says you have to have a warning hierarchy? The answer is no.
And the only two things I'd say about it, in the performance context, at the very least, what is more important is make sure at some point, though, they've been put on notice, that the employment may be terminated if it doesn't improve, and they've been given a reasonable opportunity to improve. And what's reasonable will vary significantly across industries. If you're in a call centre that has very clear call volumes, it might be a couple of weeks, which is sufficient to say, well, everyone's doing X load and everyone else, this employee is doing Y, and we need to see that lift, and it doesn't lift, and you might have very clear objective metrics. In most circumstances, it'll probably be longer. In most circumstances, you might be looking at 4 weeks, 8 weeks, you might even be looking at 3 months to give a person a sufficient period of time to take on board the feedback they've been given, to try and improve. You might have some training that feeds into that. So it's very normal for the Commission to perhaps expect that you take up to 12 weeks even to try and help someone address the issue. And that's going to then put you in a very much better position to move to the ultimate sanction of termination or exit
if things go bad. If things go bad. Just a few prompts on formal counselling written warnings. You see a lot of these written badly. We won't go through all of these, but can I just make one really important insight? And I stopped mentioning the name of the person who did this now because I once got in trouble at a party when I ran into them afterwards. If you're giving somebody a warning, you're giving them a warning in their employment. You're not giving them a warning for issue A, issue B, issue C, issue D. We once had an extraordinary situation where somebody was on 16 final warnings, and each one of the final warnings was for a different thing, the work boots, the earmuffs, the whatever, because that's how they were written. So just be very mindful that if you are ultimately cautioning people in their employment in a formal sense, you're warning them in their employment, not for a specific issue. The specific issue is just part of the facts. But those are the sorts of things you really need to take into account when you're looking at actually constructing your warnings. Mate, this is your favourite area. You'll get passionate now about all of this, but okay, things haven't gone quite right. We're going to make a decision to terminate. Off you go.
Make me sound like the one who likes to pull the trigger. No, look, it's unfortunate, but ultimately, in any case, or any employment context, eventually HR managers,
it's going to come up.
Business owners are going to face this. Two questions always arise. Is there a valid reason?
Yep.
So that's about substantive fairness. Is there actually a legitimate basis that you can no longer have the employee? If there is a valid reason, we also need to consider, in terms of substantive fairness, are there mitigating factors that also need to be taken into account? So valid reasons are either going to be about conduct, so is the misbehaviour so serious we can't have this person here anymore, or capacity, can they no longer do the job? If we take capacity in the context of a performance discussion, so you're going to have had sufficient discussions, opportunities to improve that performance, that you ultimately form the view that they are not able to do the role anymore. So it's not just, oh, well, we warned them and they didn't improve so we can terminate. That's not a valid reason. Your process has to have gotten you to the point mentally that you're satisfied, and the Commission, an independent observer or umpire, is satisfied that they are not able to do the role. Now, just when you think about what that entails, I mean, you were naturally going to need to have done a fair bit of process in terms of skilling them up on understanding what their role is, the relevant training, etc.
We get back to the foundations almost, We get back to the foundations,
Now, mitigating circumstances is an interesting one because almost anything can be taken into consideration there. You could be looking at their age, their length of service, their previous record. You could be looking at their financial circumstances personally. What impact will the dismissal have on the person? And the more drastic the impact, the more likely the Commission's going to take a more sympathetic view. The very big one, I think it's probably the most important mitigating circumstance, is length of service. I don't know why, but all the ones that seem to come into our firm, they've got 30 years plus. I don't know why.
They wouldn't send us an easy one, mate.
No, that's right. When you're in that range, it's high risk. And so you really do need to be satisfied they've had a significant opportunity to improve.
Yeah, and you know, if you're a member of the commission and somebody comes before you and they're 55 years of age, they've worked for you for 30 years and you open the record up and up until this moment, it doesn't seem to have been a problem as an employee. That commission member's sitting there going, chance of this person getting another job, pretty low. So you've got to be conscious that those mitigating circumstances will come in. Now, what I will say, though, and I'm really strong about this, is please don't start double guessing that. At the end of the day, if you've got a particular standard and a view about conduct, performance, behaviour, and that person breaks that standard, goes against that standard, subject to you following the sort of process we've talked about, you make your decision that that person's not suitable to be in your business, move them out. Come and see us about the problem if they want to run unfair dismissal case, but move them out. Because if you keep leaving those sorts of people in your business, you're just going to bring into question your values, bring into question your standards, and progressively you'll damage your culture. So you're better off saying, no, this person doesn't belong here, we're moving them out, and dealing with the mopping up later.
Now, the next element, which will really is very important when you come to unfair dismissals, which I'll touch on briefly, is to ensure your process is procedurally fair. And when we talk about procedural fairness, particularly in the performance context, there's two things. One is to ensure that they are aware of the issue that you've raised that's going to give rise to the dismissal. They're squarely put on notice about it. They've been given that opportunity to respond, and that response is taken into account. What does that all that mean? It means the golden arrow that we had just a few slides earlier, the one that you've already put the tattoo in your eyelid, you've already contracted the local parlour to get it happening, that's the one that you need to follow. In a performance context, though, it's also that prior notice to the employee that, hey, these things aren't working well. Can you ensure that you start working on this a bit better, that you meet these milestones, and you've given them a fair and reasonable length of time to improve that performance. So that feeds into the substantive fairness.
Let's say that's all been done, but the employee's filed an unfair dismissal claim. And the first thing I'm going to say is about 14,000 of these filed a year. So even if you've done it all really, really well, there's a very strong chance it might get filed. Most of our viewers probably know who can make such a claim. There's probably two areas which we get asked questions about a lot. You'll notice in the top part of the screen the non-award, non-agreement salary cap is now at $145,000. It's actually quite a high cap. We're surprised how often people don't realise the extent of that cap, and particularly around, say, supervisors and the like, frontline managers. They often be a little bit more brazen about how they go about performance managing and terminate them, only to find later on that they're actually under that cap and they have a right to claim unfair dismissal. So that's one I would say definitely be mindful of. The other one we get asked questions about a lot is the 21-day period. You've got 21 days to file an unfair dismissal claim. It's pretty much a rigid rule now of 21 days. The likelihood of exceptions are very, very limited.
That's right.
But just be very conscious that even if you do everything right, there's a very strong chance that a claim might be filed, and we see that quite a bit. Remedies for unfair dismissal. So we go and run the case. Now, we should also say, by the way, that about 85% of all unfair dismissal cases get settled in conciliation. Our firm's quite competitive about how little you settle on unfair dismissal cases for. But look, probably, I should be careful saying this because we probably are fairly low in the scale, but most of them settle probably for somewhere around 8 weeks. Would you agree with that?
Even it could be for some, depending on the circumstance, you could say 4 to 6 weeks quite commonly.
4 to 6 weeks pay, yeah. A lot of them actually just end up, well, let me resign and I'll go my merry way. But so just understand, most of them do settle in conciliation. If they don't, then the matter will proceed to arbitration, and the Commission really has two things at its main call. The first is an ability to reinstate the employee to their employment position, or potentially, much more rarely we see this, re-employ them in an alternate position.
Reinstatement is known as the primary remedy that's available to the Fair Work Commission in the sense that that's the number one option they have, but you have to bear in mind it is very rare to see reinstatement as a remedy that's actually awarded.
And I think it's about 2% of all of the applications end up in a reinstatement, and I think last year there were 36 people who actually got their job back.
Which is very low when you consider the tens of thousands or the 15-odd thousand that are filed to begin with. So the reality is that generally it won't be practicable to reinstate. There will be reasons why the Commission's satisfied that's not the right call. So let's not operate in fear of a world of reinstatement. Yeah. But in the most serious cases, the long period of service, the most
you really got
appalling
this wrong.
Circumstances.
There's no valid reason or your process is appalling.
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
Otherwise, compensation's capped at 26 weeks' pay, and the Commission has quite a mathematical formula now about how it goes about working out what that compensation is. They'll take into account the extent to which the employee's contributed to the dismissal, a whole range of different factors, their loss. What the Commission can't take into account is any general hurt, suffering, distress, but they will certainly look at the employee's financial loss. And where an employee hasn't got another job and it's been a significant period of time that's elapsed, that's when you might see a higher range of compensation awarded. But often where employees have gotten other jobs, the amount might be significantly lower than 26 weeks as well.
Yeah, 14, 16 is not uncommon.
So they're the main remedies. There's a note there about costs. Look, the general rule is you can't get your costs back. So this applies to almost all employment litigation. If the employee sues you for unfair dismissal, again, but for the most extraordinary of circumstances, you're going to be up for the legal fees.
Yeah, yeah. And look, we tend to see two sorts of situations arise with unfair dismissal claims. We'll see the case which is described as a case of principle, sometimes often the case with, say, a safety issue. And we'll have a client say, look, I need to make the point, I'm going to run the case no matter what. More often than not, though, this is a commercial decision. This is I could settle it for X amount of dollars, or Lewis, I could pay Abla X to run it. Well, gee, I'd rather settle it and buy the result and let's move on and get on with life. So there's the principled matter, and then there's the pragmatic commercial decision. And the only one that's perhaps a bit different from that is you sometimes see some trade unions when they're the person who's really the applicant for the individual, they might believe it's a principled matter for them. If clients sacks a union delegate, by way of example, the union might feel compelled to have to run that case no matter what because it's the union delegate. But those are the normal remedies. And I think Lewis's point's really the important one. Please don't let the fact that these are the remedies stop you making the right business decision for your team, for your workplace culture. Don't do that.
We went through substantive
fairness,
procedural fairness and personal circumstances. So I think that's all what we've discussed before. That's what gets taken into account, and I think that's broadly what we've already covered.
And look, that kind of brings us to the must-dos, and we might wrap up on them. One, think about those foundations I said at the beginning. If they're not set right, you're not really giving yourself the best shot at people performing to their optimum. So please make sure you set the foundations right. You've got to make that ad hoc positive feedback a habit. It's fun when you do. You do get good at it. I've put up there as well, ensure boundary alignment. One of the things that I find interesting, we talked earlier on about, making sure you understand what the boundaries are. Make sure each manager is aligned in what behaviour is acceptable or not acceptable. We often see a lot of situations where we'll have somebody who ends up being terminated in one part of the business and the union come along and say, yeah, but in the other part of the business they do that all the time. So you've really got to sit down. I often get teams to sit down and actually talk about, well, if this happened, how would we all respond and are we aligned? It's a good exercise. Follow that process, the arrow diagram, as Lewis said. Please make sure that using a performance improvement plan becomes a habit. And frankly, if you're going to invest in anything in your business, invest in frontline performance management capability. You will get more bang for your buck there than probably anywhere else in our experience. And I think that brings us to the end of today. I hope you found it useful. I hope there was at least a few insights, a few takeaways. Lewis, thanks for hanging in there even with the man flu.
That's all right.
You'll probably go to bed after this and sort of collapse and go, I need chicken soup, but we'll find out.
No, thank you for having me, Nigel, and for telling everyone about my man flu. The other thing that I want to tell everyone is that we've actually got a survey that we're running at the end of this. To the extent that you fill it out, we very much encourage you to do so, because then we'll be able to send out to you one of our very own performance and misconduct policy templates that you might want to use in your business. One of the things I'd say about the template is, because this is a bit of a bugbear of mine as well, is we often see employers introduce incredibly rigid and prescriptive performance management policies and things like that in their business that then act as the rod on their back in any dismissal process or claim. We certainly don't think that's the right way to be managing your business, and we think that a policy should actually be covering off on a few key things about what it is you're going to endeavour to do. You should be able to commit to a basic procedurally fair process, but other than that, you're going to want a bit of discretion about how you go about these things, and that's what our policy template seeks to achieve. So that's certainly available to you. As Nigel said, feel free to reach out in terms of frontline leadership training courses, any other advice you might need in relation to your policies or your performance management process.
And I'm just looking at the data. For the 1,000 of people who hung with us all the way through that, thanks very much. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time we do a webcast. Take care.
Thank you.